Um, so this story follows Joe, who is kind of an average American with an average job and an average life, um, like most of us. And his world is turned upside down when his wife is diagnosed with terminal cancer. His insurance company refuses to pay for treatment because they deem it as experimental. So he eventually turns to an online group where he finds solace with other people who are in the exact same situation, who have loved ones who are dying of cancers that are potentially treatable. So the message board itself kind of becomes an incubator for the rage and despair that these people feel. And several of the members commit acts of terrorism against insurance companies and political leaders that they deem responsible for the state of our healthcare system. Alrighty, so
And
sorry.
I would add one thing, for folks who might not have gotten through it. Joe himself is not somebody who commits an act of terror. At different points, he's trying to talk to people to diffuse their feelings, or try to help them, but he's a bit conflicted about it. And in the end, because he's associated with the group, he still goes to prison. So I mean, I guess that might be a spoiler for folks, but there are lots of themes in this story that we'll probably get into, and I just wanted to because some of what he goes through is actually part of what we might be talking about today too.
Alrighty. So before we kick off with the questions, we wanted to open it up and give anyone a chance if they wanted to just share their own story really briefly about their experiences with our healthcare system. Well, I will share a story. It's not as devastating as Joe's story, but it is kind of relevant to what's going on in our political landscape. When I first got married, I am since divorced, but that's kind of irrelevant. When I first got married, I went to the doctor to be prescribed contraception. And I was told by my doctor that my insurance would not cover the birth control pill for the purpose of contraception. So she had to resubmit the medication saying that it was for a debilitatingly heavy menstrual cycle. So I just thought that was really kind of interesting and plays into how the insurance companies get to kind of manipulate our everyday lives with the decisions that they make, similar to what Joseph went through, and also what a lot of people who have periods are going through right now. So I see Hannah, you have your hand raised, so I'll ask you to unmute.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Back in 2014, I was having some health issues and visited a lot of doctors. Couldn't get any answers from anybody. And finally decided to check with my neurologist because some of my symptoms mirrored the symptoms of one of my patients. And I thought, well, let me go. Maybe it's neurological. And it turned out that I have dermatomyositis, which is a very, very rare disease that no one can pronounce or spell, including people in the medical profession. So my husband and I were, dealing with the implications of that, dealing with the 15-year window that they gave me. 15 years sounds like a long time until you're living it. And then it isn't when your organs are failing. But we could deal with all of that. What we couldn't deal with was when we found out that one of the medications that I would have to take will cost us $100,000 a month. And yeah, that was kind of our reaction too, was like, you've got to be kidding me. No one can afford that. And the insurance company said they would not cover. It was a very minuscule amount. I think my husband and I, it started out at 110, and I think we would have ended up having to come up with $80,000 a month. And that was in addition to my infusion meds and my oral meds, which my infusion, we had to pay for the nurse to come to the house to infuse me over 2 days. There was a gap of like $3,500 a month for that we would have to pay for. And so we were looking at our life savings going down the tube. I was fortunate because my doctor was a real warrior, and she went to war with the insurance company. I mean, and as a matter of fact, she left medicine. She doesn't practice medicine now. She works for a medical group as an advocate, and she fights insurance company denials. But she fought for me. She got in touch with the drug manufacturer. And through her efforts and her efforts alone, I was able to end up only having to pay, I think we paid $3,500 at the beginning of my treatment. And then after that, I paid $10 a month. And that was it for up until 2017, when they were able to take me off of some of those meds. And then in 2018, I went into remission. And I've been in remission since then. I'm off all medication. Well, I've got RA now because autoimmune diseases do not travel alone. They don't like to do that, but I am in remission. So when I was reading Joe and Lacey's story, and I mean, you kind of go through that. You have to not let that anger consume you. And I was so sick because I couldn't stand up. I couldn't comb my hair. I couldn't brush my teeth. I couldn't wash my face because it's a neuromuscular disease. So I could only take 2 or 3 steps and I couldn't breathe. And so you're afraid and you think you're dying, and then you have all these people just, you don't know what to do. My husband, I the look on his face, I never want to see that look on my husband's face again. We've been married for 53 years, and I don't ever, ever, ever want to see him look like that again. So when I was reading this story, and I read it like in one sitting, I just read all the way through because it's short, but I could feel Joe's pain and Lacey's pain. I really did. I'm sorry, but that's just.
Thank you so much for sharing, Hannah. We are glad that you're getting better, and so thankful that you had a doctor who was willing to put in the work to help you get better and to help bring the cost of your medicine down. That is mind-boggling. Yeah. And Jamel, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Yeah, just really quickly, and thank you, Hannah, for that story. In our neighborhood, so there's somebody that we know who basically is going through a treatment, and it's cancer. And hopefully everything will be okay. But this person is a lawyer by training, and had the ability to navigate some really complex stuff in terms of pushing for an experimental treatment, or maybe not even experimental, but just something that was new, and others could qualify for it as well, but one, they don't know, and two, they don't know how to navigate the system. And somebody in the comments said, the biggest fear they have is getting sick and then having to deal with insurance, or not being able to afford it. Um, I mean, one of my biggest fears is just not being able to navigate this stuff because it's just so complicated. And I'm a lawyer, and I mean, if something happens, I will, throw myself into it, and figure it out and advocate and hopefully succeed. But not everybody's got that kind of training, and is that fair? Is it fair that uh, we so much of what you have to do is have a doctor who's advocating for you, or you're advocating for yourself, uh, and there are so many people who are not equipped to do that. Is that actually fair?
Yeah, someone in the first session, one of the participants, introduced us all to the idea of time tax. And I think that is definitely applicable in this situation, because aside from the 100% on point that you made, Jamel, about people having the experience and the knowledge to be able to advocate for themselves, but also just having the time to do this work, because it can be very, very time consuming. All righty. Unless someone else wants to share, we'll go ahead and move on to the first question.
And I'm going to put it in the chat. Do you want me to put all parts of it in, or just the first part?
All parts I think is good.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll just ask the first part though, and we can
All right.
go through them. All righty. When someone commits an act of violence for the sake of a cause that you might accept as legitimate, how do you react? Does the violence delegitimize the cause? Does the cause justify the violence? How would you talk about such a situation with your friends and or family? Any thoughts? Anyone want to share? All righty. Had some thoughts, Jamil?
Yeah, I'll just say that, I helped write this question, and I always struggle with it. It just it, I guess, yeah, if the cause is just, you can kind of, you try to understand, you try to figure out why the person might have been pushed to doing something violent, and then you try to bring them back from that, or try to correct that. Violence is not right. I mean, uh, there are messages in this story that I do get a little bit concerned about. But yeah, I feel like violence is not right, and somehow you have to talk to people about that. But you do have to be open to understanding and hearing about their cause, even if it's very remote.
Yeah. And Wes, you had something to share?
Yeah, and actually today this I was introduced to this framing or thought, and um the person who was speaking was, talking about how the term riot likes to be brought up, whether, like taking a look at in the last 2 years, with reactions to police brutality. You know, the word riot was used by media, elected officials, whatnot. And the individual speaking today was like, you know, it was civil unrest. And particularly, you know, Malcolm X in one of his speeches, it's a phenomenal speech. Malcolm X is, you know, you say I'm the one who does violence, but let's talk about who's really doing violence. You're doing violence upon my people simply because of who I am and what I look like. And so, you know, and I was just like, I really love that term, civil unrest. And you know, I have never been in a position where I feel that's where what I need to do to respond, but I can understand, particularly if you are a Black, brown, indigenous person, you know, sometimes you've done everything you are supposed to and it's still not enough. And so I'm not saying I promote that, but sometimes I think civil unrest, you know, sometimes it has to happen. If we hadn't had civil unrest, our country wouldn't exist today at the same time. So you know, so that's kind of what, it's kind of where I'm at. Yeah.
That is a great segue, I think, to the second part of the first question. So in this story, angry constituents take out their personal frustrations over the loss of someone in connection with decisions of an insurance company. The author notes that the first bombers were not labeled as terrorists. Why do you think that was the case? Anyone have any thoughts?
Angela has a response in the chat, and let's see if Pam's hand up.
All righty. Yeah, so just Angela noted because there were white men. Yeah. Pam, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Hello. I took it as they were white, but it just seems like a lot of times it's a lone wolf, so there's no big deal. You know, it was one person who did something and not a group, and he was white. And I think that was pointing that out. Because I don't understand when you have the mass shootings and everything that it's not terrorism, but that's what I was thinking, is it's a lone wolf situation if it's just one time, one or two times. And American, exactly. So those were my thoughts about that.
And Wes puts in there that our laws don't even have a label for domestic terrorists. I also thinking on, you know, what Wes noted about civil unrest. I was thinking too about how that MLK quote about a riot being the language of the unheard. And I feel like there's such a dynamic that goes into this. Because as you guys mentioned, the guys in the story likely weren't labeled as terrorists because they are white men. And I feel that there is, just like with everything dealing with race in this country, there is a sliding scale, right? When there are people who are aggrieved, you know, a lot of times we don't listen to certain demographics. And that can be the reason why they turned to violence in the first place. And in certain situations, we over provide the platform for them. Because I think that was one of the things that happened with leading up to the January 6th insurrection, where we spent so much time considering how and why the people who committed those acts of white nationalism, white nationalistic terror felt aggrieved. You know, we gave considerable amount of platform to their viewpoint, where we don't always give a, the similar viewpoint to other demographics. So the last part of this question: fear is often used as a political weapon to motivate constituent behavior. And specifically in the story, we heard a lot of talk around the people in the message boards talking about how something would finally happen because these people were afraid. And even though it's not a one-for-one parallel, I do feel that fear is often used as a weapon in our own real life political discourse. Is that an effective tool? Is that something that progressive candidates should be employing? I know some people are using kind of a fear-based tactic. They may feel it's justified because of the abortion rights being revoked and such. So what are you guys' thoughts around that? And I see Hannah has her hand raised. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, I think that, like, with the abortion rights, since you brought that up, well, anti-abortion people were blowing up abortion clinics and killing abortion doctors, in order to try to get their way about things. So each group will have its extremists. You're never going to have a cause that doesn't have an extreme wing. I just think that no cause, like with the insurance company or with abortion rights, that's not something that I think violence is ever going to be the answer. But when I was reading the novella, I kept thinking these people had that in them anyway. If it hadn't been this cause, it would have been some other cause. If you have a name, Dr. Death, I think that was it Dr. Death or whatever? No, Dr. Death was the movie, but Death Eater, that was his name. Some of these handles that these people had, I think they were angry. I tend to believe that people are angry anyway, long before anything happens to them. And when something happens to them, they grab onto it because now they have an outlet for anger that was already residing in them. Otherwise, everyone who was put in this same situation would blow up and start blowing up buildings and killing people instead of looking for other solutions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hannah. Peg, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thanks, Robin. Also, when I was reading about once there was one bombing, then there were the series of them. And, you have to wonder, like, at what point did the first one give way to having others in that dark web group kind of do copycat bombings too? And at what point does a forum to share grief and disturbance at a healthcare system turn into, well, we've really crossed the line? And unusually, there wasn't anyone in that group who had a significant level of fear, and I'm not sure if Joe's reaction was really fear when he kind of lived in that, angst of getting the FBI come after him. But none of the other ones, I mean, I didn't have the impression that any of them really even cared in terms of fear. Like, I don't think they cared about having fear. I think they were almost immune to fear because their anger just overtook any other emotions that they were feeling. And the angry grief is what drove people to these actions. And in terms of using fear as a motivator when it comes to elections and party platforms, I mean, I think we see that very, very blatantly in these times. And that kind of lends itself to why America seems to be more and more polarized. That is, it's us against them, no matter who the us is and no matter who the them is. And it will be, at the very least, interesting to see how the 2024 presidential election plays out, because I am sure that people's fears are going to be capitalized on. And instead of, imagine a better life, imagine your life worse. Because a better life, I think people don't feel like will bring people out to the polls to vote, but they may be motivated to come out to vote if they're scared enough that things will turn for a negative.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Peg. Hannah, you have your hand up. I'm gonna go ahead and ask you to unmute.
That was from the last time. I forgot to put it down. Let me lower it.
No worries. Thank you. Alrighty. Any other input before we go ahead and move on? Alrighty. I'm gonna tweak this next question a little bit. But is it ethical or unethical to make a profit off of other people's illnesses? Should there be a limit on such profits? And really, I think part of the thing that we have trouble with in this regard is how to balance that, right? Because we know we have to pay for research, we have to pay for people's time and expertise, but where does that line get drawn? Hannah, you have your hand up.
Okay, so with my disease, I found out that, well, I already knew this because I was working as a clinical supervisor in a pediatric practice. And so I, spent time dealing with insurance companies and getting medication for sick children, which is a whole nother battlefield. But when I myself was diagnosed with what is called a very rare disease, there's no research for my disease because not enough people have it to make it beneficial for the pharmaceutical companies to do research. And it was only after I had been ill for like 2 or 3 years that my illness even gained what they call orphan drug status, which allows the pharmaceutical companies to do research in conjunction with similar diseases that could be treated with similar drugs. So the profit angle, I think people are always going to profit from other people's misfortune, and we can't stop that. I mean, because doctors go to school. I mean, nursing school wasn't as expensive as going to medical school, but it wasn't cheap either. And then all the training that you have to do after that and the continuing education and everything that comes with it, it's expensive. So people need to be reimbursed. But I think we need to cap it. We need to find a place where we say to, particularly to pharmaceutical companies, enough is enough. And they're trying to do that in Congress right now. And I think, was it last week, the GOP just blocked an effort to put a cap on some drugs. I mean, like even insulin. So yeah, we need to cap it, but we can't say people can't profit from it, because everyone who has a business and offers a service deserves to make a profit. They just can't take advantage of people.
Yeah, and that's definitely the hard part, because as you mentioned, we do live in a capitalist society and people deserve to be compensated for their work. You mentioned orphan drugs, and I was listening to an NPR interview, and I'll try to remember which one, but they brought up that concept of orphan drugs and how drug companies will use that as a way to extend extend their the longevity of their price hikes, and use it to be able to increase the price of a drug in the first place, because they will take a disease that is relatively common and slice it up into demographics and say that this drug applies to, for example, like breast cancer in women from 18 to 22, and this drug is in women from 23 to 40. And even though it's the same drug, they'll either change the way it's administered or they'll change the dosage, and now it's labeled as an orphan drug, which they are then allowed to basically set their own prices for. And that actually makes me think of, all right, so unless anyone has any other comments for this one, we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. So the extremists in the story had two primary targets: healthcare executives and government officials. In your view, what are the biggest barriers to healthcare reform? So in other words, should we be focusing on regulating the healthcare industry, whether that be more oversight, more regulation, more transparency, or should we be focusing on the government aspect of that and trying to push for candidates that support a public healthcare system, push for more government intervention into how drugs are paid for, how drugs are labeled for pricing and things like that? So any thoughts? Excuse the puppy in the background. So Kara listed in there money, lobbyists, and private interests. And I am also listening to the audiobook of a American Cartel, and it is basically the story of how drug companies, American drug companies, fueled the opioid epidemic. And it's exactly what Kara listed there: money, lobbyists, and private interest, because a lot of the lobbyists went directly to the Department of Justice, and in some instances uh, tied the hands of DEA agents who were trying to push for more regulation and more oversight on American drug companies who were just constantly producing and shipping opioids to communities in order to maximize their profits.
At one point, I think that there's a discussion in the story that, yes, maybe the healthcare executives were the targets, but I'm sorry, like the insurance company executives, were the targets. But they also talk about the fact that, within the insurance company, there are claims processors. There are people who are not executives. There are people who Joe says have a job similar to his, or maybe even not as good a job as his. And he's trying to identify with those people. And yet at the same time, I think the parallel is drawn between, in a drug cartel, you've got mules, you've got foot soldiers, you've got people who are helping the cartel do its bidding, but they're not the leaders, they're not the executives of the cartel. Those are the people, those people are punished. From the bombers' viewpoints, they basically were saying, well, within these insurance companies, those foot soldiers are fair game, just as a drug might be fair game. Curious as to what people might think about that. We've got a quiet group tonight because I think because it's a tough story. That's, but and a lot, but I would actually say a quiet group, but very active in the chat.
Peg, if you wanna, then.
Somebody said higher up in the chat that there really is no law against making money in capitalism. In fact, it's encouraged. And strictly economically speaking, like, isn't that the point of capitalism? Make as much as you can, and that's competition, and competition is healthy for the market and everything. But it has evolved in the absolute worst sense, where humanity has been diminished in favor of profits, and that we as just regular citizens are kind of the victims of this. And it's not it's a crime, and it's not a victimless crime. And yet to hold a CEO accountable for making all of this money off of medicine, like, people would laugh, like, isn't that the point of capitalism? And we see it even with gasoline, and Exxon and Mobil executives making all these billions and billions of dollars. And I knew, at least, or thought, during the pandemic, when everything was on lockdown and gas prices tanked, that once we started to come out, those CEOs were really going to gouge us in terms of a gas price. And that's what's happening now. And while the pandemic is not a fair comparison for a drug CEO or lobbyist, but at some point, the price gouging it's just gotten out of control. And at some point, it really does need to be heavier regulated, and a line has to be drawn at some point, because you're really just perpetuating things.
Yeah, in that book that I was telling you guys about, American Cartel, one of the things that the DEA is trying to push is negligence. That even though they are trying to maximize their profits as a business, they have to sorry about the dog. You have to counterbalance that with human life, because people were dying and they were showing them evidence of deaths because of their negligence. So Kara, you have your hand up, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Okay. You know, I'm so mad about all this. I can barely speak, and that's why I haven't been. This story could have been me back in 2008, and it's still too raw to talk about. But I can tell you that the emotions that Joe felt, and that even the people on that group list, they're so very valid. And I think the defining factor for the people, well, they are men, but still, that went out and did something, was that they had nothing left to lose. And, you know, their families were gone, or their wife was gone, their son was gone. They had nothing left. So what does it matter? I too had to try to fight the insurance companies, and by myself, while I was horrendously ill with a very, very rare form of cancer. It was just a nightmare, just an unfathomable nightmare. No one will talk to you. You ask for everybody's supervisor, and it doesn't make any difference. It's just impenetrable. And it's so shockingly, horrifically wrong. I'm just getting so angry just even talking about it. And unfortunately, I think it is capitalism, because certainly, you know, other countries make it work, the UK, and I've got friends there that say it works just fine. You know, of course, Scandinavian countries. And we're just so, I won't say the F word, we're just so messed up over here. We just can't pull our head out of you know what, and it'll just be greed. It's just greed, and nothing else matters to these people. And that's the bottom line. They're untouchable. They'll go to their bomb shelters, or they'll repopularize the moon. No, sorry, not recolonize. They'll colonize the moon. They'll just flee. You know, even when, you know, climate change and everything, you know, don't even get me started. It's horrible. And that's why perhaps some of us just can't even speak. I'll shut up now.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing your story and your perspective. And actually, what you were saying kind of just made me think of, you know, parts of the story where there was one part where Joe said that instead of, you know, considering the cost of, you know, actually providing affordable care for people, they just increased security and they passed it on to uh, regular citizens by increasing premiums and charging a security surcharge for healthcare. And there are a lot of industries that do that. My brother-in-law was telling me, you know, that he and my sister went to go buy a new car, and I forget the acronym for it, but basically there was a surcharge on adding on the car. And he asked about it, and I wish I could remember what the acronym stood for, because basically it boiled down to, we're charging you more because we can. We're taking advantage of the situation and the fact that parts are difficult to get. So we're charging more because we can. And Hannah, you have your hand up, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, I, first want to say to Kara, I so sympathize with how she's feeling. But I think as someone who's watched numerous family members die from cancer, as a pediatric nurse who on occasion had to tell parents that their newborn child was not going to live longer than 3 months, I still cannot wrap my mind around a violent response, like blowing up an insurance company. I can't do it. And I think, and I know Wes and Jamal and others who heard me speak before on certain issues, I can get very wound up about racial issues. But the biggest victims of all systems in America are my people. We're always the victims. I mean, we didn't have an opioid crisis in this country until white kids in the suburbs started dropping dead, and then everybody got all bent out of shape. And I told Hank Johnson, who is my congressman, when he called me, I'm like, I'm not working with you on this. Go call somebody else, because nobody called me when this problem was in our community. So don't call me now, because I'm not going to do it. So if any group of people were going to blow up insurance companies and blow up hospitals and blow up police stations, just blow up everything in America, it would be us. But the people who are out there blowing up stuff and destroying stuff are the people who enjoy the most privilege in this country. The reason the men in that book were white males is because the men who take AR-15s and go into schools and kill first graders are white males. And the men who get angry and go into churches and kill people while they are in worship are white males. So when people talk about Blacks killing each other one-on-one, well, white people kill each other one-on-one, so people who commit just mass crimes for no reason other than you hate somebody for the color of their skin or because of their religion or because they said something you don't like. So you go find an innocent group of people who are not even marginally aware of your existence, and you shoot them, and you get in a hotel room and you shoot and kill 57 people. I cannot in good conscience say there is any reason, even losing a loved one to cancer, to go and blow up a building full of mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles because you can't sort out who's just there trying to earn a living and who's the executive there making the decisions. I can't get behind that. I think that's just a bad slippery slope. I hope we never can say that should happen.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts there, Hannah. And I actually want to make 3 points really quickly in regards to what you were saying. One, regarding the opioid epidemic, in I can't remember where I read it. It might have been in this short story or that other book I was telling you guys about, American Cartel, where they mentioned specifically that Black and brown people were not affected as strongly by the opioid epidemic because of bias in the medical care system. There have been studies that show that people of color are often not believed when they are in pain, and so they are generally underprescribed for pain medication. So the opioid epidemic completely bypassed, or not completely, but largely bypassed Black and brown communities because doctors would not prescribe pain medication to Black and brown people. The second, to your point, Hannah, was one of the things that I thought about was um, property damage versus human collateral. Because I know there's a lot of talk around, like Wes was talking about before, like rioting and things like that. And as soon as there's property damage or something like that, then a lot of people want to talk about like, oh, well, they should find other ways to make their points. And like Jamel was speaking earlier, like, does violence delegitimize a cause? In that specific instance, it's property damage. Do we differentiate property damage from, human collateral? And I forgot about the third point, so I'm going to let Wes speak since he's got his hand up.
Oh, this Wes?
Yes, Wes said first.
Sorry. Oh, I'm not shy. My camera is just on the blank. So otherwise I would go video. But one thing I just appreciate the conversation about the injustice of our healthcare system and the responses to it. One thing that I do want to lift up is that just in a practical sense, there are about a dozen states that have not expanded Medicaid, which is mind-boggling. That there's a law on the books, resources available to help people, and that's already passed. It's law. There's money in the budget, and all a state has to do is say, I want it, I agree to it, bring it here. And there's still states that haven't agreed to it. That is, their own tax money is going into the program and not coming back. And all of these states happen to be voter suppression states. I'm not saying there's a link between those two, but there's a link between those two. And, and they happen to be states like Texas, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina. And all of these states, all I can say is if there is a candidate in one of those states that you can get behind and work for this November and help Medicaid expansion in those states, please do, because that is going to help so many people, particularly people with chronic mental health conditions. This is their only support system. The only way you can get decent or even any kind of care for a chronic mental health condition in this country is to go through Medicaid in many cases. And for many, many people, this is their lifeline. And states are not, it's like there's money that just, it's the answer is like right before them. And they're not refusing, they're not taking it out of some weird form of spite or ignorance. That's not ignorance, or it's hard-headedness, or just a basic refusal to do things that are in the public interest. So I would strongly encourage you to look at the list of states that have not expanded Medicaid. And if there's somebody, a candidate or a cause or a coalition that you can support with some time and some treasure in those states, please do, because that's part of the answer. So let me stop preaching. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that, Wes. That's a very important point. And actually you reminded me of the third point that I wanted to bring up to what Hannah had said before. So I'm going to read you guys a short paragraph from an article. And I think I may have listed it in the reader's guide, but I'm not sure. But let me read it. Go ahead and read it here. The way we designed our healthcare coverage, we did it by attractive demography. So we did the veterans, we did the unionized workers during World War II, we did Native Americans, then the poor, the elderly, the disabled. And then under Obama, you did the working poor. Who's left that anyone cares about? All sorts of people that don't fall into any of those categories and probably don't vote. So I'm gonna say those last three words again, because I think that's really important, especially for this group, that probably don't vote. And I understand that there's a lot that goes into that, especially to Wes's point regarding voter suppression, and that it's a lot easier to just encourage people to vote when there are other things that go around that. But this is a study that's done that shows that the same demographies that are most likely to not vote are the ones that end up on the bottom in terms of, our country's priority for healthcare. That was an article. I will put the link in the chat. But also, before I do that, because I cut and paste. So to Hannah's points and to our next question, and I will get that link in there. I'm sorry, Mary, you have your hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute.
Okay, just a quick correction for the SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse Mental Health Association, declared that the African American population increased 40% opioid deaths and substance use disorder. It may be not apparent, but there's a lag, but it's devastatingly on the rise. So it's kind of a misconception that it's not impacting communities of color. Latino and African American populations are just as impacted. The difference is that we go to jail, and other communities are offered treatment, but it is affecting all communities, because this problem is not necessarily a prescription, but something that you buy on the streets.
That's a good point, the rebound on that. And thank you for that, Mary. That's a really important correction and important points that you bring up there. Thank you.
Thank you.
All righty. Any other comments before we move on to the next question? All righty. Another multiple part question. So Black and brown communities, people of color, and low income communities have been dealing with inequities in our healthcare system for decades. Similarly, with the abortion access debates, activists are pointing out that the lack of reproductive rights of Black and brown women were a precursor to the eventual dissolution of rights for all women and people who are able to give birth. So how do we frame messaging going forward that advocates for universal health care while not diminishing the history of systemic oppression? And also, how do we craft new legislation that does not repeat past inequities? Any thoughts there?
I see Hannah has her hand raised.
Sorry, I sent it. If Hannah, if you don't mind, I sent it to ask you to unmute.
Okay. I have a thought. Because as I said, I think last week, no decisions in this country are made based on the needs or the impact that anything has on African Americans unless it's coming up with a new way to put somebody in jail. But when it comes to reproductive rights, they don't care. I mean, they don't care about our pain, like you said. I mean, they don't care. And I worked with doctors who were told in school that Black women don't feel pain like white women. You know, the first time I heard that, I was like, okay. So I don't know how you can change a system that, number one, is not, right now, is not interested in the health of the people. The healthcare system we have is not interested in the health of people. It's interested in making money. My son and my niece both left medicine, and we had a family full of people in medicine. My niece is a doctor, my son was a PA, and they got out because, you know, like the things that they saw, some of the things that I saw, this healthcare system cannot be fixed because the people who run it don't see that there's a problem. If they thought it was a problem, they would have fixed it a long time ago. But they think it's just fine. It's serving the people it's designed to serve. And so they don't see that they need to fix anything. And we can't get legislation through because the people who own stock in these pharmaceutical companies and in these private hospital systems are the congressmen who are sitting in DC making the rules and sitting in the state legislatures making the rules. They own stock in these companies. So they're not going to do things that are not in their best interest. So I don't really see how we are going to change anything.
Thank you for your perspective, Anna. And Jamel, if you don't mind sharing your comments.
Yeah, for your question, I guess, you know, in terms of the part saying how do we address things without losing sight of some of the racial inequities, you know, as well. It just brings me back to the race class narrative of, you know, that Ian Haney Lopez, you know, raised in the last book that we discussed, Merge Left. If you haven't read it, it's another great one. It's not fiction, but I do think that throughout that book, he talks about methods for weaving the two narratives together. You know, the
Race, class.
racial inequity and basically class inequity. And you know, when we have a healthcare system that arguably works for those who have the money, who can pay for the insurance, who can and the ability to navigate it, et cetera, but leaves others behind. It is a race class thing. So maybe we go back to him, and we just say, hey, what would be the narrative for this? I think he might have even raised it a little bit in the book, but we could use what he was saying there to help address your question, I think, Robin.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Wes, if you could unmute.
Well, again, to the issue of representation, I think is very important. There is now, and I agree with a lot of what Hannah said, that there's a lot of people with a lot of financial stake in the system who keep it resistant to reform. But I think now there is in the U.S. House, there is a Black Maternal Health Caucus led by Representative Underwood and Representative Alma Adams. I don't know Representative Adams' history, but I believe Representative Underwood is a career public health nurse who got elected to Congress. I don't remember, a couple of years ago, but she has written legislation on the Black maternal health crisis. And one thing you could do is ask your own member of Congress whether they have joined in support of that legislation and that caucus, because I think the maternal health legislation that Representative Underwood wrote is another one of those things that's at risk if Republicans get anywhere close to returning to the House, returning to leadership at any level. They'll certainly undo any of the positive gains that we've seen even this week. So I think anything that that you can do, for instance, to help your own Democratic member of Congress, even if they don't seem to be at risk, is something that would be helpful. So just an all-in strategy might be good at this point. So
thank you for that, Wes. And Spock, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear
Can you
you.
hear me?
Mhm.
Excellent. As a white person, I don't think it would be great for me to making comments at this point of this discussion, but I was waiting until other people talk because I wanted to talk some more about the violence part of it and the protest part of it. The thing that I have been writing about and work on for a long time is activism, and I have used people's greed in order to seek some sort of retribution. And specifically, I was focusing on violent rhetoric coming out of right-wing media. And I used that in order to defund them. And we're talking about Corey's book here. And I know him from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I don't want to go into the whole long story, but I basically got sued for copyright violation by quoting the violent rhetoric that was used by right-wing hosts, talking about killing people, blowing terrorists, blowing people's brains off, killing Muslims. And I took it to the advertisers and I say, do you want to associate your brand with this violent rhetoric? And they didn't. And I showed them in all their various different message statements and things like that, that you are supporting this violence because right after they say it, they read your copy. And it was incredibly successful. They were owned by ABC Disney. They came after me. And I used that story to talk about the violent rhetoric of these people and cut them away from the advertisers. And I then taught that to multiple other groups that got used against Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, etc. And the thing that I learned was when you get in the way of people's revenue, they really freak out and they come after people really hard. But I had the people on my side who were the advertisers, like the good, like the Bank of America and those people. They didn't want to associate it with violence. And so I've thought about how to use this, and particularly looking at during the George Floyd protest and comparing it to the protest used by the January 6th, the January 6th riots and violence. And they always bring up how many people were, injured or murdered or whatever. They make stuff up about the George Floyd protests. And it's been interesting to see how people are justifying, how they justify and explain the difference between the George Floyd protest and the January 6th protests. So what as I think, what's my point here? Looking at if somebody else is using violence, or if you use violence in a certain way, how you, what actually happens after it? How is that, how does that, effect change? And if other people use violence and they get away with it, how does that affect change? And I pointed out in the chat earlier, I had written about Ruby Freeman and her daughter Shay, and they got multiple violent death threats, and they weren't followed up on. And I've been writing about how the right uses death threats and violence against people in my anti-gun activists, and they rarely get followed up on. Ruby changed the script a little bit by suing the One American Network for defamation and winning a multi-million-dollar case. The violent death threats still have not been followed up on, but that case and lawsuits like that, where it is you're the victim of the violence and they don't necessarily care. However, the people, when there is a massive lawsuit, then they notice, okay? And again, this could be the difference between, a person of color being threatened and somebody else, but it was something that I wanted to encourage and think about as a way to affect change when it is you're not the one causing the violence, but the violence is directed towards you, flipping the script, basically. And so that was something that I really wanted to kind of bring up when I read this story. And I read it a long time ago when it first came out. And I remember thinking, it's a lot about the story of, the individual and the heartbreaking piece of it, but they are the sympathy would shift from the person who the heartbreaking story to the innocents that were killed, unless there is some other, circumstances that made it that, oh, the person who, caused this was a horrific person. And I don't think we see enough of the horrificness of the executives who are making billions of dollars. It's excused away. So I have kind of utilized these understandings of the way our systems work to, I feel like, good effect. And the one, more recent one that I had done, I mean, not recently, was getting people such as I got, Glenn Beck off of Fox News, not because the horrible things that he said, but because he was losing the corporation money. They needed their quarterly profits to go up. So this is using what drives corporations against them when they have somebody who is using violence or threatening violence and showing them that it's bad for business. So this was kind of my thought about saying, okay, I don't like to use violence that way. How can I use other systems, other goals and values of these people that they put in priority against them to change the system?
That is awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And you make excellent points all around. And I think it's interesting the kind of underlying fact that just keeps coming back around is money. There's so many different things about the way our economic system, the way our government system works, where the largest motivator is not taking care of citizens, taking care of each other, but what does the bottom line look like? Yep. All righty, so it is 9:53 here on the East Coast, and we are coming to a close. So if does anyone have any final thoughts or comments before we go ahead and wrap up?
I would, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to raise this in the wrap up or not, but one of our last questions was, what would you ask the author about this story? What was in his head? What was he trying to accomplish for this and for the others? And Robin, do you want to
Yeah, we
share
can.
our news?
Yeah, then it's the next slide.
Okay, all right. Last time we forgot, so
Yes,
I
we
did
did
not want
forget.
that to happen.
Thank you. Thank you for that reminder. Yeah. Alrighty, so our next session is the last session, and the novella for that one is Mask of the Red Death. So it is just at a very high level a story of survivalism versus community. So in the story, basically, it actually starts out similarly to how 2019 started out, where there was a thought that society would collapse. There's viral contagion, people getting sick across the country. So it kind of has a Walking Dead type feel, even though there are no zombies or anything. But just for content warning sake, there is gun violence. There is death from viral contagions, and I know a lot of people are understandably stressed and fatigued from us all living through a pandemic for the past 2 years. So just keep that in mind as you read this. And it's also funny that this story came out in 2019, like roughly right before all of this happened. And there is also depictions of death by suicide in this story. So again, just to reiterate, you do not have to read the story in order to participate in book club. So next slide is the one where we have the big news. So the author of the book, Cory Doctorow, is going to be joining us for our final session. And I did not correct the time. I'm sorry about that. He will be joining us from 8:30 to 9:30. So make sure you guys get here at 8:30. I'm sorry, I did not correct the time on this slide, but we do have, and we'll provide a link in the chat and in the follow-up notes where you can submit a question to be asked to Mr. Doctorow.